Hey everyone, it's Andrew Schiffman.
Harry Turcotte here. We both worked at MTV in the music and talent department in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah, it was a time where music videos, TRL, The Jersey Shore, and the Osbournes ruled the airwaves.
Yes, Andrew, those are some great years. So tune in every week as we catch up with old MTV co-workers, record label execs, VJs, and artists.
I can't wait, Perry. We'll give you insights into meeting superstars before they were superstars and some juicy secrets from that golden age of MTV.
So grab your headphones and get ready to relive the era of music television and the people who shaped a generation.
Welcome to the Music Lounge. How is everyone doing? We are back, new episode, recording this towards the end of the year. You are seeing us. Let's say this is the first one of 2026.
So happy New Year. Happy 2026, everybody.
Yes. Happy New Year. How's it going, Perry?
I'm doing well, Andrew. I'm very excited for our guest today. He actually has told us that he will not go on any other shows for 30 days so that we have an exclusive on his story. So without further ado, I would like to introduce David Cohn, formerly EVP and GM of MTV2 Hits and Jams. Welcome, David.
Welcome.
Good to be here. Hey, listen, I was never a very good negotiator, so I gave up that exclusivity pretty cheap. But I don't know, whatever. We'll see who else calls me. I may have to break that promise. Once we do such a great job here, who knows? The floodgates might open.
Listen, if you get a call from SmartList like Freston did, we won't mind. So before we jump into everything, please like, share, review, and rate the podcast so that other people can find us and other people can listen to us, and we can ease up in the rankings across social media and on the streaming channels. So, and thank you everybody who listened to us in 2025. We greatly appreciate it.
Yeah. Interact with us. Comment. Let us know.
Yeah, absolutely.
How we're doing. Feedback, guys. Feedback.
All right. So I know that when we were talking about doing this, you had said that you were fairly young, 23, when you started at MTV, I believe, on your birthday. So 23 years old, it's 1984. MTV was really starting to make a mark in the television space, in the music space, in cultural space, in the youth space. You come into this channel where it's kind of got no rules, no HR, apparently, according to Freston, basically. And you got access to all of these artists and the excesses of the 80s. How did you survive in those early days? And actually, what was your journey to MTV? And why did you stay for 20 years?
23 to be exact.
23.
Yeah, 23. Let's see. My journey, just short version, is I just graduated from college. I was a communications major. I promoted concerts during school. So I wanted to work in music or in television. Literally, the gods shined on me. One day I had written a letter to a guy who I knew through a cousin who was working at ABC Sports. I go to see him in New York, and he says, "Well, I don't have any job for you, but I'm looking at your resume. It sounds like you'd want to work at MTV." I was like, "Yeah. How do you do that?" He said, "Well, I know a guy there." He picks up the phone. And he says, "Hey, Rick, it's Larry. I have this kid here. Yeah, I'll send him right down." It was Rick Grimm, who was the business manager of MTV.
Wow.
And I walked 6 or 7 blocks down 6th Avenue and met Rick Grimm. And we talked music, and he liked me. Because there was no HR, it took me 6 months to actually start working there. That was September or October of 83, and I started on March 12th, 1984, working in the mornings, half day at Nickelodeon for a guy named John Kennelly, and in the afternoon for Rick Grimm. And again, not only was it just lucky stepping into that job, it was lucky on so many other levels. If you had on paper, there probably would have been a dozen other jobs at MTV that would have sounded better to me than being the assistant to the business manager. I had no finance background. I, could add 2 + 2, but that was about it. But I was at the channel. I was, half day. I was at MTV, which back then fit on one floor of 1133 Sixth Avenue.
Wow.
And the even better part was I was working for Rick and John, neither of whom wanted to be business managers either. Were very good at it, but as you may know, they both moved into the music department
Yep.
in the next couple years. So did not begrudge me making a move and, having different ambitions and things like that. So it really was just complete, complete luck
Yeah.
that I
So
stepped
what
into
was
this
a day
place
to day like?
at that time. At that time, I'm sorry, Andrew. What?
What was a day to day like in the business area in
Oh,
the 80s?
both of them. A little less so at Nickelodeon, where you had some adults, Jerry Laybourne and Ann Sweeney, and some really unbelievably talented people. They were normal people. MTV Crim was unbelievably essential because nobody, to say it this way, nobody really knew how to add 2 + 2. Anything that involved numbers, they would call Crim. And so he became this essential piece to Sykes and Les Garland and all these people, amazing characters that were there at that time. Um, but for me, it's not what I wanted to do, but I can answer the phone and I would take people's invoices and I'd put them on the copy machine, hit copy. It was completely mindless work,
Right.
but I was at MTV, and and even more so, right when I started, they carved out a piece of a wall, and they gave Rick this windowless office, and so I sat in this pit outside the office, which was a very, very key location. It was right outside the men's bathroom. And so everybody used to come through there, bigger than life characters. Every once in a while, somebody would yell four, and Les Garland was hitting golf balls down the hallway, and or saying, "Come in my office." Jagger's coming in to play the new record, and he'd have crates of champagne to listen to the new record, and it was just
Wow.
shit like that would happen, reasonably often. Back then, they would the studio was at 57th Street, and the scripts for the VJs had to be typed out. So I sat right by the script typists, a guy named Colin Gary, who was one of the most unbelievable, wonderful people ever, Neil Yellen, some other folks. And Judy McGrath was the head of editorial. She'd have to come and bring a script to these typists. And they would type up the script, they'd give it back to her, and she'd leave.
Wow.
And then 10 minutes later, she'd come back and say, "Oh, we made a change." And they would white out. And it was
Oh,
madness. But it was this sort of crossroads of the office. And so, here I was, a kid, making copies and answering the phone, but you got to know
you were
everybody.
exposed to everyone. And yeah, if
Yeah,
people wanted expenses paid, they probably came to you as well.
very essential. I used to hear shit like, there was another amazing character, may she rest in peace, woman by the name of Gail Sparrow, who was also in the talent department. You'd hear her yell down the hallway to Les Garland, "Hey, Les, who did you use on your T&E this week?" And he'd say, "Bill Thompson," who was the manager of Jefferson Starship or some friend of his. And he'd say, "Okay, I'm not going to use him this week," And so they're negotiating of who they could claim they're having dinner with on their
Yeah.
T&Es that week. And then,
We all
to your
did that.
point, they would give it to me. They would give it to me and say, "Hey, could you put a rush on this? I really could use I'm running out of money. If you could get me a payback quicker than the normal 3 weeks, that'd be really great." So I endeared
No,
myself to the executives by getting their T&Es paid more
yeah.
quickly than they expected.
No,
Hey,
like private jets
Essential
or
work,
anything?
essential work in early MTV.
Any like private jets or
There was
crazy expenses?
there was no private jets. You said it in the intro. It was 84 was a huge year for
Right.
MTV. Thriller and all that stuff. I missed, and I'll tell you the story in a second. But I missed those early, really scrappy days. But by no means was it at all corporate or even, frankly, well funded at that point.
Mhm.
So people were just hanging out, and the culture that Tom talked about, I think accurately, was based on a bunch of things. That one, it was all music then. So if you were there, that's why you were there.
Mhm.
Second, everybody was young, single, Tom says in the book he was one of the few married people, and that's true. Nobody had kids, nobody was married. We would get 25 people on a weekend to go play softball in the park. Because what else you can do? Nobody had any money. My first salary was $16,744, and I was
Ooh.
like, wow! I was like, wow, that is a. If you stack that up, that would go all the way to the ceiling. If you put that, as long as it was one. But people would come and they would hang out, and the ethos absolutely was, we're only going to do stuff that nobody else has ever done before. If somebody has done this kind of thing, why
Right.
would you bother doing it again? So it just created this, this camaraderie. Another thing that Tom said, I don't want to reference your last episode too much, but the demo back then, remember, was not, absolutely not teens. It was, there was this
Yeah.
notion of the aspirational theory that if you target 18 to 24, the teens are going to come along because they want to be 18 to 24, and the 25 plus are going to come along because they want to still be 18 to 24.
Right.
The people who work there were in the demo. There wasn't a lot of overt strategy. I was a junior kid. Maybe there were conversations that I didn't know what was going on, but it wasn't like there was a lot of overt strategy. We were trying to amuse ourselves. What's the music we love? What are the ideas that crack people up in a meeting? And what haven't people done? And just as a collective of all these people, it was incredibly fun. And when you tell people you worked at MTV, you got this impression they thought it was like a beach blanket bingo, like people were dancing on the desks or something like that, and it wasn't. But it wasn't that far off.
Right. Right.
It was fun. Something I referenced before. All things are relative. I was amazed at the environment that I walked into. I'm a hick from northeastern Pennsylvania, and I don't know what I'd walk into. But the fact is, I had people as soon as I started who would pull me over and say, it's a shame you weren't here in the old days. It was so much better.
They referred to 2 years earlier as the old days, huh?
Absolutely.
That's funny.
I'm not exaggerating, because then it really was, what did Tom say? Seven people or whatever. And then it grew a little
Right.
bit. So it was a small core crew. And by the time I got there, as open and fun as it was, you knew it was going to work. There wasn't, it was working.
Well,
And
84
so
was also the first VMAs, wasn't it? Or was that
84 was the
85?
first VMAs. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was at the first 23 VMAs. And like it was all kind of winging it. The people who were there were people who didn't really want to work in traditional television. They did bring in, what was that guy's name? Don Ohlmeyer was a major sports producer.
Yeah.
He was a producer of the first VMAs. And I don't know how involved, I'm sure he was very involved, but again, I was way out of it at that point. It was a very fun, very intoxicating time to be there. And, and Nickelodeon, was not where I wanted to be, but really, really smart people and very dedicated people in the same way to their mission. So I learned that at a very young age. It's just like, why are you here? What are you trying to do? And then go for it.
Yeah.
Tom mentioned this a lot in his book, that the 80s were a lot different to what me and Perry experienced in the late 90s through the 2010, 2012. As technology and your roles grew, how did you adapt to the change? And what were the different roles that led you to general manager of MTV?
Well, first I'll say, just collectively, success is great, but then the expectations rise, the internal expectations rise, the financial expectations rise. The press, which was the lifeblood of that channel, it wasn't worth doing if the press wasn't going to talk about it. The stakes just kept on getting raised, and certainly for the 80s and well beyond into your time, we just kept meeting that challenge. It couldn't be quite as anarchic, I guess, as it was to meet those. For me, I'll tell you, I think in those earliest days, if you asked me what my career ambition was, it would have been, how do I get on the record label mailing list? How do I get free records out of this deal? I don't think I had a particular plan, but I moved After about 2 years of working for Rick and John, they both moved on, and I moved into the marketing department. It wasn't a particular strategy or expectation of where I wanted to be, though I think kind of inherently I must have known that the balance of a creative job that was connected to the business
Mhm.
suited me very well. And I really enjoyed the pathway for me between starting and getting to what was my dream job of running MTV2. I moved into a department that was created called promotional development, which was the earliest of
Oh,
working
wow.
with sponsors to do program. Sponsors didn't touch anything in the early days of MTV. They
Right.
ran commercials, and that was it. That was an era of, we're not going to commercialize rock and roll or whatever, but we figured out some things to do. And so I did that. And then I moved into the marketing department proper, into a quote unquote local promotion role. And then I became director of national promotion. And what those things did was, the first one gave me exposure to working with ad sales. The second gave me exposure because anything we did, local promotion, which was, VMA flyaways and stuff like that, that gave me, a deep working relationship with affiliate sales and distribution. And the national promotion, I'm still relatively young. I was doing contests in the heyday, well, actually the later heyday. I missed the Bon Jovi's house and Paint the Mother Pink John Mellencamp thing, but we did some very cool stuff after. And I created a bunch of concert tours, the first MTV branded concert tours. And so that gave me exposure to the music business, to artists, to managers, to working with the labels on promotions that we did. And then I moved to London. But, really that foundation in the 80s was all the things that I kind of needed to do much later, as the head of MTV2, because, as
Right.
much as I was very involved in the creative vision of MTV2. Distribution was everything. If we're not enough homes, it doesn't matter what we do. As we got into more homes, how are you going to make money? So my familiarity of working with those other departments outside clients, was very valuable. Really, my big break in the 80s, which is, I think, very representative of the way things worked at MTV back then, is I was working for this guy, Bobby Friedman, in that promotional development, role that I said. But Bobby had been second to Preston in the marketing department. And in 1986 was the first spring break. And the first spring break was purely a sponsor driven. I think it was Miller had a concert, Starship or somebody, small crew of people went down to cover this concert in Fort Lauderdale. People went down, came back with all these unbelievable stories. You won't believe what the kids are doing. You won't believe the scene on the ground, all this stuff. And let's make a big deal about it in 87. So I wasn't involved in that at all. And one day, I'd sort of heard the rumors that Fort Lauderdale had decided they didn't want us. And this is probably late 86, maybe January 87. So relatively close to March 87 when we're going to
Mhm.
do our first big spring break. And I'm not involved at all. And I knock on Friedman's door and he beckons me in, but he's on the phone and he's got his back to me and he says, I can't come to Daytona tomorrow. I got work. I'm not gonna come down there just for, and he turns around and he sees me and he says, oh, I got somebody. I'm going to send somebody down tomorrow. So I was like, what am I doing? And I got on a plane and it was to meet with the hotel people who were going to give us a location and some money and rooms for the production staff. And because of that, literally walking in this room at that moment, for the next 5 years, I became kind of running all non-production aspects of spring break that I was
Oh,
completely unqualified to do. I'm meeting with city council people, I'm meeting with hotel owners, I'm meeting with the police. It was freaking insane. I mean, and I didn't know what I was doing, but you kind of danced around enough to do it. But the people down there were so crazy that I became valuable because nobody on the production team who were busy actually trying to make television wanted to deal with this shit. And I dealt with it for a couple of years. Sorry to say, I didn't watch your Sally episode, but then Sally started getting more involved and she was actually qualified to do this stuff. Sally,
yep.
by year 2 or 3, I was partnering with Sally and then she took it over, but we did it together. And, and that's really a very much a big part of my perception of the 80s is spring break is my birthday's in March. I turned 26 through 30 in Daytona.
Wow.
Love.
I kept on getting older, and the kids stayed the same age,
Yeah.
and it just got more and more insane. And then I moved to London, but I used to tell people that that's why I moved to London, was to get out of doing spring break. I mean, it
Well,
got bigger and kind of uglier and all that. It was an amazing break for me
Yeah.
because that was my first high profile dealing with production. People depended on me to get certain shit done in Daytona, and I guess I rose to the challenge, and it worked out. But there are some stories in Daytona that will not be told on this or any other podcast ever. Maybe I'll write them up for after I'm gone.
I was in
But
college in the late 80s, and I have to say that the idea of spring break became more vivid and more something that you had to do only because of what we were able to see on MTV spring break. Do you know what I mean? It was like
yeah,
you knew that spring break existed, but you wanted to go to spring break because you had seen what happened the previous year's spring break on MTV. So you
yeah.
now wanted to be a part of that.
Certainly some of it was already existed, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
all of a sudden it's broadcast nationally. There are major bands coming down, and it was also one of those times, even more so than New York, because New York's always a bit of a cynical place. You went down there and you had an MTV Spring Break laminate. You could park on the sidewalk. You could walk into places and run red lights. It just, you cut every line at every restaurant and every club. It was just, it was a little bit, it blew up our heads a little bit of how important we were, because it was so central, and then it kind of ran its course and they moved along.
it's about
That really was my big break of getting more exposure around the whole channel to be
right.
able to do some stuff later.
You mentioned like not having experience. I mean, who really had experience those days anyway? Because it probably never been done before, right? Like spring break programming on broadcast TV, like MTV was the first. So probably a lot of
Some
activations.
people had some people must have had some logistics experience of
Yeah,
production. Again, that's why Sally did such a great job, because she at
right.
least did know how to do it. I did not, but that's all right. But to your point, yeah, that was, and again, there it really was. I guess the hiring ethos back then was no experience necessary. It really was. It
Well,
really was just, if you had the hustle and you had the right vibe, and they would let you do it. And it's kind of legendary of MTV, of things that happened that way, of the things that happened that were notable on the channel, that came from various parts of two promo directors, my great dear friends Peter Doherty and Ted Demme, creating Yo MTV Raps.
yep.
Things that came out of the news department. Again, it was a unstructured kind of environment, that if you had the hustle and you wanted to do stuff, you could kind of just do it. It was
But
pretty
getting
great.
back to what you said earlier, there also wasn't a lot of brands wanting to sponsor stuff on television either. And you guys created that whole thing too, right? You bringing in.
Well, I'm not sure that they didn't want to. At MTV, didn't allow it. I mean, it wasn't the same level of things you see today on any kind of network outside. We were very precious. Again, it was this idea that you can't commercialize the music. That probably held on longer than it probably should have. The audience probably got past that a lot quicker than a lot of people that we did at the channel, of integrating it in things like spring break, the music tours that I did. We did a bunch of college music tours, were very sponsor involved, and that's what justified them. You tried to find that balance, which was always kind of tricky, of staying cool and giving real value to the advertiser. All that stuff was a great lesson for me as I moved along. MTV Europe started on August 1st, 87, I think it was. And, a crew of people went over there. A guy named Brian Diamond, who was a day one MTV New York guy,
Yeah, yeah,
moved
yeah.
over there. and a bunch of other people. Mark Booth, who was a friend of Tom's, who was an exec in the affiliate sales department, he went over to run it. And it was a joint venture with Robert Maxwell. It was a couple of years in. And in late 90, my wonderful boss at the time, a head of marketing woman by the name of Harriet Seitler, said, well, they're looking for a head of marketing in London, and I'd like to put you up for it. It came at a good time. I wasn't sure where my career was going. I think I fooled myself a little bit and thought, this is a really good career move. I don't really want to do it. I'm not sure I'll like doing it. It sounds like a career move because I was having such a good time in New York. And remember, this is in 1990, and everything is firing on all cylinders, and we were having the time of our lives in New York. And quite frankly, my crew of friends, Judy and Doug and Van and Carol and Tina, and that's they were ascendant. That was becoming the real, the real brain trust and major people at the channel. And I was like, I don't want to leave that. We're having John and Rick. We're starting to run the music department. I don't want to leave this, but this is good for my career. I don't know where I'm going. Let me do it. And it was, and all that, but I was fooling myself. It was the greatest experience of my life. I moved over there and started the marketing department at MTV Europe. Had this one woman, Katie Hayes, who's a dear friend of mine, who had been doing it on the sly almost. I thought I was going over for a year. I stayed for 3, and I will tell you the one, kind of point back to something that I said before. One of the reasons the culture was so great in the 80s was that the people who worked there were the demo. And so, again, even when I moved in the marketing department, there wasn't a classical marketing there in our brains of what we do. You were just, again, trying to amuse yourself. I'm marketing to myself. What would I want to hear? And I get to London, and and they think, oh, this guy's done really well at MTV New York. He's going to be really good. And I get over there, it's like, oh shit, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. This is a different market. Yeah, the terrain is different, but I would say somewhat hubristic notion of, this will work everywhere. And over time, and Tom referred to this, they realized they had to localize things. But back then there was this idea of 21-year-old and 18-year-old in London or Hamburg or wherever has more in common with an 18 or 21-year-old in New York than they do with their own parents.
Right.
Not untrue, but a little way oversimplified, right? So what messages to do, how to do it, how to do the terrain. I realized again that I really had no formal marketing training. Kind of would have come in handy of a little bit of the science of marketing, of how to do some of these things. Once I got there, I danced hard, and I figured some shit out, and we did some fun promotions and tours. They did have me try to start a spring break, and we flew down to Ibiza, and it was just it didn't work out. It just wasn't right. That was such an American thing. The London experience was just amazing, and to this day, I've got a crew of friends in London. I go back at least once or twice a year, and it's the greatest thing I ever did. And my poor wife had to watch me run around Europe for 3 years. I'd been married for 6 months, and again, I told her we were going for a year. After 2, she reminded me what I had originally said, and we went back after 3. That was my London years, but it was great fun, really great.
So getting now into the 90s, and you're back in New York, the cable television's bandwidth widened in the 90s. MTV was creating branded channels. We had MTV Hits and MTV Jams that were 24 hours of genre-specific music videos, as well as MTV2. What was your role in developing these spin-off channels, and how did you end up becoming general manager?
My role in creating them, relatively minimal. I mean, even though we're in the 90s and things had changed somewhat, some things hadn't changed. My memory, which I hope is mostly accurate, is that M2 was created and started like a month later. We can start a channel, therefore we should start a channel. And it just happened, and everybody, whatever I was doing back then, I guess I was VP of consumer marketing at that point, had dual roles. but we didn't really do any marketing. And so it was, so it was created, as M2, and everybody loved it. It was great fun, but there was no advertising. There
Mm-hmm.
was really limited distribution. And I'd say it kind of got forgotten for a bunch of years. People in the office, myself included, watched it diligently. I think the labels watched it diligently.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody else, literally nobody else. And then, Perry, you just said this, technology and business drove it as much as anything.
Yep.
I had a
Mm-hmm.
98, mostly driven by the affiliate sales group. They created what they called the suite, MTV Networks, the suite. And that was these digital channels to take up the new digital bandwidth
Yep.
that cable operated. So it was a land grab. And
Yep.
again, something that could be done incredibly easy by the existing staff. You're just running videos. When in your old department, the music programming department, I was adding another program. I totally forgot this until I looked it up on Wikipedia. The first, there was an MTV that was hard rock,
Oh, yeah.
and MTV that was Spanish. So in my research, hits and jams didn't start till 2002. So yeah, I
Right.
probably was part of that. It was a land grab as much as anything, and the fact that any of that stuff still exists is still just a land grab. I started as general manager in 2000, or maybe late 99. But again, things were firing on all cylinders at MTV, and the internet was clearly part of
Yep.
the future, and MTV.com was becoming clearly a priority. And this notion of MTV 360, we start talking about in the strategy
Yep.
meetings and all this. And it was, MTV has clearly evolved to be music plus culture plus other non-music programming. MTV.com is going to dominate the internet and be the music destination. And let's make M2, that by now rebranded MTV2, let's make that part of this MTV 360 strategy. So, to be honest, at that point, I raised my hand. I went to Van, and I've been working closely with Van on MTV movies and programming. And I said, "Can you let me try to turn MTV2 into a business?" It had been run out of the business development department. A guy named Matt Farber had been a big
Oh,
part of
right.
starting it, and then Eric
Yeah. Yeah.
Sherman, who
Yeah.
worked for him. Most of the work was done by the music and talent department and the production team led by Lou Salato. So we're doing cool stuff, but nobody else was really paying attention. Again, nobody was making any money. There was no real priority to it. And I said to Van, in some point early-ish in '99, I said, well, I'd love to take a shot at turning it into a business. And he responded positively, but said, I need you here for lots of stuff that's going on at MTV. And again, we had a killer year on the VMAs that year in '99. And then in 2000, they put me in charge of MTV2. And that's what I did from 2000 2007. But it was again, it was everything I wanted to do. I loved that it was going to be a creative challenge. I loved particularly that it was going to be a music challenge, but the fact that there were business necessities of getting distribution. Those first couple of years, we didn't take advertising. I think we probably started in 2003. Whenever Preston would see me, he would say, there's the guy with the best job in the company. He doesn't have to make any fucking money. I should have listened to him because, more money, more problems. And it became challenging. We had, through a complex deal and lawsuit and other stuff, we had taken over the box, ownership of the box in the late 90s. And we decided two small channels made no sense. If we combine them, we can have one bigger channel,
Right.
and take that distribution and add it to the existing MTV, and get to a place where we could sell some advertising. So I oversaw the integration and the kind of elimination of the Miami box office and the integration into MTV proper, and the business into MTV2. And that happened, and we did a lot of fun stuff in 2000 to 2002, and then stuff started getting more real, and we got into about 50 60 million homes and started selling advertising and making some real money. But those were actually bigger challenges. The early part was
Yeah.
a lot of fun, and all upside, as we paid attention to really for the first time getting really not only the dedicated MTV2 staff, Lou and people and Holly and Alex Coletti, my dear friend, came over and started working more closely with me on programming. So that was all great, but that's when Calderon and other people, started really, putting their talents to the channel as well, on the marketing side, on the programming side, and we got serious about it, and made a business out of it, albeit for not that long. So
What year did they start getting ratings on the channel?
well, with advertising comes ratings. So I think it was 2003, and I'll tell you guys that I don't have a lot of regrets. It was a lot of fun, and I did the best I could, and I think I have some things to be proud of. There are two things I wish I could undo, and in the grand scheme of things, I'm not sure any of these matter. Number one, this is probably 2001. A guy named Mel Karmazin was running the company. Tom was head of MTV Networks. Mel Karmazin head of Viacom. And that's what, even though we weren't making any real money, that they started bringing me to the yearly budget meeting and kept on referring to MTV2 as the Deuce, the Deuce, the Deuce. And just as we did sort of colloquially in the company. And at the end of the meeting, Mel says, "Why you keep on calling it the Deuce? Why don't you actually change the name to the Deuce? I like that better." And Tom jumps on it. Very quickly we knew the Deuce had been licensed by ESPN for MTV, but he said we should change the name. And Mel's idea, and Tom agreed. There was this idea that you see sometimes: create your own competition. Compete with MTV, but something that we own, so it doesn't matter who wins; it'll all be our upside.
Well, that was what VH1 was originally, right?
A little bit. VH1 was VH1, yes, but VH1 kind of came also as a competitive move, not only a demographic expansion, but that was definitely a flanker brand that grew into something much more than that. Yes, it was that essentially that strategy, and I fought the name change and won that battle for a couple of reasons. One, affiliate sales was way against it in terms of distribution. No one's going to give you distribution on XYZ channel. It's all about the MTV brand, and they were probably right.
Yep.
But also, I was a MTV 360 zealot. We were still very much drawn into this idea of the MTV mothership and satellites that were going to dominate the world in a complementary fashion, and that was the way to do it. But over time, I wish I had lost that battle, because you don't want to be the two of anything. Right. You want to be the one. The better to be the one of something than the two of anything. Some of the changes that came later that maybe we'll talk about in a couple of minutes might have been a little different.
Well, let's get
if
into
we weren't
that.
so linked to the MTV brand.
Yeah.
Let's get into
well,
that.
I'll tell you the second thing. Here's my segue. Here's regret number two. We were very full of ourselves and thought the key to this, and we made a very strategic decision, Van and I and others, we just need to get in as many homes as possible, as quickly as possible. And so in doing that, we made a decision to forego affiliate license fees. We had a couple of deals that paid us. I'm sure you guys know that was the beauty of the MTV model. We were getting paid all this money on the one side from the cable operators, and get paid all this money on the other side from the advertisers, and that's why it was such a crazy good business.
Right.
So we decided to forego the one side of it in exchange for accelerated growth. Completely sensible, but at that moment, and the other one, the MTV2, that's 2020 hindsight of changing the name. This one, I really wish I'd been smart enough at the time to realize the second we didn't take affiliate revenue, or diminished our affiliate revenue, made ad sales, ratings, etc. primary. That was the only way we were gonna grow.
Right.
Was through that. And like I said, in a little bit of 2020 hindsight, but maybe I could have had some foresight. If you want to run a music channel, which is all I really wanted to do, that was counter to it. So some of the changes that came later.
To get the revenue and the ratings, you had to forego pretty much 24 hours of music videos to more long form programming, and then re-airing MTV's programming, and then acquisitions. When I was there, it was a lot of Martin and programming like that. So
Yeah,
it was
a couple things. First I'll say I used to, I was fond of saying in my earliest days at MTV2, the great thing about MTV2 is that we can play any video we want at any time. The problem was we did, and so the fact that we put some more strategy onto it, the fact that we started doing long form and $2 bill concerts and other things, that wasn't even so much a rating driver per se. That was just our creative ambition. Just playing videos, with no disrespect to the music programming department, two people could do that, as we did for many years on Hits and Jams and others. So we had much greater creative ambitions than that, and that's why Alex came over and other people got more interested. But again, it was a little bit of a slippery slope, and then the ratings. And as a music channel, we just kind of plateaued at I think it was like a 0.07 rating, which is not nothing, but it's kind of less than something. And as you're trying to get growth, it was inefficient and
Mm-hmm.
and not good enough. And we did a whole brand analysis. This is probably 2003, where we looked at the strategic options of what the channel could be. And one of them was remain a 24/7 music channel of some sort, but one was to complement MTV more demographically by becoming more male centric. Played out those options, and I advocated staying a music channel, which may or may not have been the right choice, but I am what I am. That's
Mm-hmm.
why I was there, and I lost. And we chose to make that move, and we had some fun with it. That's when the two-headed dog came, and I'm very proud of the work that Tina's group did. People like Joe Armenia, Kevin McCall from Promos. We did a really cool kind of rebrand effort, but the programming put us into a different, not only non-music, culturally it was very cool with a lot of video game stuff, a lot of skater culture. So it was kind of fun, but it led us into being more of a traditional television network than I think ultimately. I don't think that was a game. I don't think that was a game we were ever going to win. And in fact, again, I'm not making excuses. I'm not placing blame. These were all things that I not only own, helped the bottom line for the company and helped the bottom line for me too, I guess. By the end, I left. They blew out the MTV2 dedicated staff in early 2007. I stayed for a while longer, but just before that, I realized it wasn't working. If you remember some of the animation shows,
Mm-hmm.
Wonder Chosen, which was a fantastic show that I would have put on MTV2 at any point because it was so provocative and so different. But it was fucking expensive. The animation stuff we were doing, we were starting to spend $300,000-$400,000 on an episode, amortizing it over a bunch of years and all that. And it was like, geez, and let's face it, this was also at a time where the early warning signs of the beginning of the demise of cable was you saw the
Mm-hmm.
cable wasn't going to be growth. You saw the internet was going to be the growth. You saw that it was eating away. In late 2006, I remember Tony DeSanto had started working on MTV2 with me, and a very unbelievably talented guy. We started putting together a kind of new plan, not to go away from that kind of long form and just be this radical different sponsorship model. Anyway, we never got to it because then they decided to kind of pull the plug. The stuff of running Martin and The Godfather and whatever else they could get from the Paramount library, that's after my time. I can't imagine that I would have wanted to be part of that. The only thing that I was ever a little bit envious after my time, that you guys were there, so you remember, and I was only on the outside. They did that hip hop Hollywood Squares for a minute. I think that started MTV2. That was a good idea. I don't remember if it was good or not, but they kind of stopped trying. And again, that's not pointing fingers. I think the idea of the of a secondary cable channel at that point was kind of pointless. My next job was Advice. I worked Advice in 2008, And it was when they started, they were on top of the world. It was very reminiscent of my MTV time. And I went to their first meeting with a company to get a big chunk of investment. And one of the ideas on the table of what they were going to do with this investment was start a linear channel. And the guy from this investment firm points to me. He said, "You're the MTV guy, right?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Do you think it's a good idea to start a linear television channel for Vice?" I said, "Absolutely not." And that was the last time I was invited to those kind of meetings. So, so anyway, by 2006, by 2007, the warning signs were there that growing a linear cable television network were already there. That it those days were over. MTV had a perfectly good run for many years after, but MTV2 was not.
Was Sucker Free Sunday originally on MTV2 or was that on MTV?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you.
That was amazing programming.
I think it grew so big into a brand that MTV wanted it. Some of these programs, Tuma Butterman created them for jams, but they were too big, right? So
yeah. The talent pool of people who were touching those channels were incredible, and so those guys knew everybody, had great ideas. I really let them loose on MTV Jams, which at that point, again, we were hoping that hits and jams could become something of the next wave. And they really did great stuff on jams. But so I'll tell you the story about Sucker Free. I'm living in London, 1993, and that was a moment of NWA. And I just it gets to be the turn of the year for 92 and 93, and I read this quote from Eazy-E, the late great Eazy-E, who said his goal for the new year was to be sucker free in 93. And I thought that was the funniest thing I had ever heard in my life. So I kind of catalog it back in my head. 10 years later, I'm at a MTV2 staff meeting that I'm running, and I tell the team at the early in 2003 that our goal was to be sucker free in 2003. People laugh or whatever, and then we're doing this. We had decided to bring back a hip hop show, an alternative show, and a hard rock show. I made these decisions, some of which were right and some which were wrong. We bring back Headbangers as is. We don't bring back 120 minutes. That's one I regret. We called it Subterranean. It seemed odd to me to do a show about new music with an old brand, but probably should have kept the classic brand. But I was not going to touch it. What's that? They did eventually.
It came back eventually.
Yeah. Well, that was a lot of things came back eventually, and then I and I was not going to name this Yo MTV Raps, which a lot of people were pushing for, just because Yo was just so iconic and so cultural. Ed and Dre were funny. It was comedy. It was culture. It was everything. And we weren't going to do that. We just wanted to play the music. That's all we really had the bandwidth to do. And then Kevin McCall, I was waiting, what should we call it? And I see that the decision has been made. I don't even think I approved it, to call it Sucker Free. And I was like, where'd that come from? They said, "You said it." I was like, I didn't know anybody was listening to me.
So thank you again. And to anyone listening or watching, please like, share, review, and rate. It helps us grow and get higher in the algorithms.
And Happy New Year. Talk to you soon, guys. Thanks, David. Bye.
Thank you for joining us today in the Music Lounge.
And tune in next week to hear more stories about your favorite era of MTV.